Thank you both.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So, thanks, Tami. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I was asked to kind of prepare some opening words, an opening statement of sorts, and so I wanted to say a few words about my own interests and how they intersect with this project, and talk a little bit, and maybe give a little bit of context for that. My own interests with Lost in Jüdischer Friedhof Weißensee I could talk about them in three areas, and I talk about this also as a way for you to maybe be thinking about what draws you in, what hits you, as Tami said. I could describe this as the poetics of walking, stories of human mineral encounters, and forms of memory that are multidirectional. And I wanted just to say a few words about my own experiences in Berlin as a way of talking about how I'm invested in this work, and that these sites, and particularly ways in which Berlin, not only for me, for many, works as, or is a kind of palimpsest text which is overwritten with other texts, which is a word I'd been thinking of before I came into space and saw the other exhibit, which really triggered me to get thinking about sites that are overwritten with other sites, particularly the Sebastian Landis pieces. And the last time I was in Berlin for an extended period of time was 2014. And I remember one of the first things I remember seeing well there was this massive billboard with the word Steine on it, which stones. And this was an advertisement for an exhibition I found out at the Charité Museum for Medical History. And this artist, this Jewish-American, Glasgow-based artist, Ilana Halperin, had curated the museum's collection of body stones, which took up an entire wall of kidney stones, gallstones, organized by color and therefore by chemical composition. And these were part of a collection called New Landmasses. And next to them were the sculptural objects, geological objects made by the artist as she collaborated with natural and synthetic geological processes. And it was really amazing to think about this in terms of physical geologies as a way of drawing connections between the earth and the body. But years later, I met with Ilana. I had the opportunity to become acquainted with Ilana, and I mentioned the billboard to her, and she said for her it was not just an advertisement for the show, but an act of remembrance for those Jews in Berlin who had emigrated, who had been deported, or had been liquidated. And this word Steine, which is a noun meaning stones, was for her also a remembrance of the family name Stein. And it was also a show of resilience. And this is one way in which I think of Berlin as a space of multidirectional memory. That's one really important site where the stones carry this other meaning. So Ilana's work explores one way in which stone is overdetermined and multidirectional. The German Jewish writer and scholar Walter Benjamin is another key figure who spent many years in Berlin, whose books we see in this space. And there's one brief passage I just wanted to read, which is really important, I think, for the discourse of walking. It's from a review that Benjamin does of his fellow writer Franz Hessel's book, Spazieren in Berlin, On Foot in Berlin, from 1929. And from this review, Benjamin writes, Spazieren in Berlin is an echo of the stories the city has told him ever since he was a child. An epic book through and through, a process of memorizing while strolling around, a book for which memory has acted not as a source, but as the muse. It goes along the streets in front of him, and each street is a vertiginous experience. Each leads downward, if not to the mother's, then at least to a past that is all the more spellbinding. It is not just the author's own private past. As he walks, his steps create an astounding resonance on the asphalt. The gaslight shining down on the pavement casts an ambiguous light on this double floor. The city as mnemonic for the lonely walker, it conjures up more than his childhood and youth, more than its own history. This translation was from Rodney Livingstone. Again, that's Benjamin writing in 1929 about Franz Hessel's 300-page book On Foot in Berlin. So I mention this to give a sense of, or to give one point of a discourse of walking that I think is sedimented in the city. These were two really important writers writing about Berlin, and also to give a sense of another voice offering a experience of place that is vertiginous, and it's an experience that walking facilitates. A third text about Berlin and memory comes from someone I'm teaching this, whose work I've been teaching this quarter, the Afro-German Berlin-based poet, activist, and speech therapist, Mai Ayim. And I had the idea of reading Ayim's 1992 poem, Germany in Autumn, Deutschland im Herbst, as an example of multidirectional memory. This is a key term. I think it's in the title for our conversation today, which I take from Michael Rothberg, who attempts to lay out a theory of what he calls a counter-tradition in which remembrance of the Holocaust intersects with the legacies of colonialism and slavery and ongoing processes of decolonization. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Okay,
yeah,
cool. Autumn in Germany. It is not true that it is not true. That's how it was. First at first, and then again. That's how it is. Kristallnacht, in November 1938, first shattered were window panes, then again and again human bones of Jews and blacks, of the weak and the sick, of Sinti and Roma, and Poles, of lesbians, and gays, of and of and of and of and. First a few, then many, more and more, arms lifted and joined in, applauded clapping or stealthily gaping, as they and them and he and she and him and her, first once in a while, then again and again. Again so soon. A singular incident in November 1990. Antonio Amadeu from Angola was murdered in Eberswalde by neo-Nazis, his child born shortly after by a white German woman, her house shortly after trashed. Ah, yes. And the police came so late, it was too late, and the newspapers were so short of words, it equaled silence, and on TV, no picture of this homicide, no comment on the incident in the newly united Germany that so much likes too much to call itself reunited. It happened that here and there it was first houses, then people that burnt down, first in the east, then in the west, then the whole country, first at first, and then again. It is not true that it is not true. That's how it was. That's how it is. Autumn in Germany, I dread the winter. That's Maya Ayim from 1992 from her book Blues in Black and White.
Is that your translation?
Thank you. That is Maya Ayim's own translation.
Really?
Yeah.
And the book is published in English, or
the book is published in is published in German. Blues in Schwarz-Weiß. Blues in Schwarz-Weiß. And I wanted to bring these three voices, or these three texts: Alana Steiner, Benjamin's review of Berlin on Foot, and Ayim's Germany in Autumn, as a way of giving a sense, further giving a sense, because this work really does it, but thickening this sense of a hollow ground, of works that resonate across time in a multi-directional way, especially this line from Ayim's poem, and the police came so late, and die Polizei war so spät da. I was reminded of this during the recent Halle synagogue shooting rampage, which had no police protection, as many people pointed out afterwards, on Yom Kippur, the most frequented day of service. So I bring these three readings as some context for Berlin, for these sites, and I hope they resonate with you, and they help us to activate these pieces tonight.
It's such a powerful poem. It feels like a blessing, like, you know, like you need to like start a study, an active study with a blessing. I guess what I want to try to do sitting here with Jason and with all of you is to try to get into the depth of the exhibition and kind of what's underneath it. And there's a couple opportunities to do that, but this is a very unique opportunity. And so we'll see where it goes. I think where what you just put forward places me is I guess in two directions. One is with this something that I think is very specific to what I was trying to do in the installation, which is evoke the ways in which objects and kind of, I guess, remnants that come off of a body, that have been touched by a body, that have been marked by a body, can become or act as a kind of surrogate for places and histories that are not immediately present. And so this is kind of, I mean, with the poem, you know, it's stated that, you know, the murder of a black person in Berlin bears with it this kind of iceberg, you know, and in some way one doesn't even need to be so intentional about it or so historical about it. It's something that's very visceral. And I think that in I guess somewhere that I could start specifically in the installation is there's a train ticket to Poland that I used to get to Poland, and it's one of the pieces kind of in the back corner, and I wrote a letter upon it to the person that I was visiting, and this was written once I returned to Bellingham from being in Berlin for 6 months and doing this this work with the cemetery. And in the letter, it ends by saying, "My lawn is Warsaw." And so, as you would see in the installation, my great-grandmother was from Warsaw, and my trip to Warsaw while I was doing this performance work was very significant and a kind of turning point in the decisions that I made, in how I was bringing my work from a very kind of private, ritualistic space and daily encounter with Jüdischer Friedhof Weißensee, which is the largest intact and active Jewish cemetery in post-war Europe, into the public sphere. And the experience that I had when I returned, which is also an experience that I had in a different way within Berlin, or within this space, was that the things that were mundane and kind of surrounding my life or deeply part of my life, like the grass that I had to cut once a week outside of the house that I rent with my family, bared the stuff of where my family is from in Poland, and that there was kind of no way to separate that which is pervasive and mundane in my life here and that which is deeply ancestral and traumatized in the only ancestral place that I have, and that I specifically intended to come into proximity to. And I think that notion of proximity, the notion of coming into contact with a place, with a space, and then marking it or letting it be marked by you is something that is kind of at the core of what, I guess, what even performance means in this work, or what I mean by performance, or what I mean by duration. I mean, really, the whole project surrounds this idea that I was going to devote myself to this place, to this cemetery in Berlin. And so the repercussions of that is, are something that come through even like what it means to find a pipe or an exhaust pipe, or to write about my lawn or something, right? Yeah.
Could you say?
Yeah. Do it. Go ahead. Yeah.
Could you say more about? I'm really interested in this relationship between, let's say, Warsaw and Berlin for you. I mean, if the ancestral site for you was Warsaw.
Warsaw, yeah.
And so I'm really interested how you came to access that history, these histories, these even family stories through Berlin. How that process works, which is maybe some kinds of displacement there, but it comes through I think it comes through that there are these relations there. Could you say more about?
Yeah. I feel like I'm gonna get there, and I want to first say, and I wanted to say this in the beginning, but I was so moved by that poem, I was like completely silenced by it. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm having this experience these days where when I hear of, these kinds of acts of violence are actually very mundane right now, extremely mundane, right? But it's been a year since the Tree of Life massacre. Just to begin to go through everything that's happening around us, and in Rojava and everywhere, that lately I've been getting so emotional. I have a young daughter, so it's kind of been intensified by it. And Jason just had a baby too, like a couple months ago, so I got very emotional there. But I want to say that Jason and I first met because there was a translator coming to Yale, where you were doing your PhD, who was translating Paul Celan, who's a Jewish poet from, I guess, Western Ukraine, from Chernovitz, and who really revolutionized the word after the mid-20th century decades of catastrophe. In his particular case, the destruction of European Jews. And so this person was translating Paul Celan into Arabic from German, and was giving a talk about that. And so, so we're coming kind of back here after many years to speak about my work, which is also kind of a child, in my view, of Paul Celan, and this notion of kind of going in many different linguistic and cultural and historical directions in one act. So my relationship to Berlin in terms of familial roots is that my wife was born in Berlin. So my family, in that sense, I do have family rooted in that city, and I first came to the city as someone visiting family and becoming part of a family. And so, this Berlin is really my wife's childhood landscape, similar to as it was to Walter Benjamin. My wife is Jewish on one side and non-Jewish German on the other side, and so she grew up within this very particular kind of tension. Her grandfather, who was Jewish American, wouldn't visit them in Germany because of his relationship to that country as the perpetrators of the genocide of European Jews. And so she's like really born into that struggle. My family is from all over Eastern Europe, and including Warsaw. My father's grandmother was born in Warsaw, and I was the first person since she left to return. For me, the cemetery that I was working in was a site of is a diasporic site, right? So it's not, in some way, it's not limited to German history, and that's something that I was trying to record. And you can see kind of in the materials, there's this attention to where people were from, that on some of the gravestones it would say aus Posen or aus Warszawa or aus Czernowice, or really all over. And where people are from changes based upon the year that they were buried. So there's multiple generations. The cemetery starts in 1881, which is also a significant year in the installation and in Jewish history, and it's something that I'm kind of working with. So 1881 commences the pogrom era, which is also the dismantling of Russian Jewry, or the largest Jewish population in Europe at that time, and the waves of flight and migration of which I'm a product, and most Jewish Americans are a product, but also the flight of people that would have, a disproportionate influence on the way that Nazis talked about what it meant for Jews and who the Jews were within within Germany proper, what Germany was at that time. So there was this very concerted relationship to the Eastern Jew, flooding into, or they were understood as being like more primitive and unassimilatable and more traditional, and they're kind of like in the neighborhood that I lived in Berlin, from which I was walking every day to the cemetery to do this study, this work, this contact, this be in proximity with this space. There were, I think, 19,000 East European Jewish refugees living there in the early 20th century within Prenzlauer Berg, right? So the cemetery, as being a reflection of Jewish life in the late 19th century and early and 20th and 21st century, is a deeply diasporic space, right? Yeah.
Which you discuss. saw or heard you describe somewhere as a Heimat. I think the cemetery is Heimat, which is a really interesting kind of a homeland, which is an interesting maybe juxtaposition for diasporic people as well.
Yeah, right. That tension between movement and kind of omnipresence.
Right.
Yeah, and like polycultural, polylingual. These attributes of I hesitate to say Jews because there are of course often that term by itself is abused, that there's great variance and diversity within the global Jewish diaspora and its history, and there are some Jews that were indigenous to places without moving. That's not really part of Ashkenazi or European Jewish history. But this sense of of being in multiple places, or having oneself being like polylocated, in tension with this will that I had in the project to see if I could kind of live in this unlivable space. And to I guess, I mean, the project is called Lost in Jüdischer Friedhof Weißensee, so at core it's about being lost in such a place. And I think what you're citing is a story that I told you a couple of days ago, which is when I first arrived in Berlin. I was hosted by an art institute called the Institute for Art and Context. And I was there. I was participating in a colloquium called Experiments and Interventions in Public Space. And it was a colloquium of artists from all over the world, including Lebanon, Colombia, Taiwan, Japan, Russia, Lithuania, Germany, Poland, Morocco, Croatia. So we were from all over, and we were all working in public space in Berlin in different ways. And when I arrived there, I gave a talk about what I was going to be doing. There was an Afro-Canadian who's a woman, a filmmaker, who was present, and when she listened to me speaking about going to dwelling and studying and basically committing to going almost every day to this vast site that's marked by a genocide, but also generations preceding and exceeding it, which in particular kind of formed this arc that I felt like I wanted to confront, while at the same time kind of interrogating within myself what does it mean for me to be lost in my own identity? What does it mean to take something that feels innate and also, I guess, taken for granted, and to go into a space where I'm really interrogating fundamental assumptions about what it means to be Jewish, or what it means to descend from European Jews. And she, when I was describing all of this, she understood. She was nodding her head the whole time. And I think that when we talk about multidirectional memory, we're talking about the ways in which history is never singular, right? That there's this way in which power weaponizes history in order to service itself, and then creates these kind of competitive frameworks so that that to remember one atrocity means to take up the space of another, right? And so the argument that Michael Rothberg is making in this book that we're citing, which is the far left on that shelf, that Jason cited in the beginning, is that the memory that a conflict of memories doesn't produce less memory but more memory, and so and that memory is not a zero-sum game. So in this sense, when I saw this artist nodding at me, and she was the only black woman in the room, I immediately understood that it was coming from a place where she's had to confront the void of the transatlantic slave trade, the void of having a tradition, a language, a history, a family, a culture, a literacy or we should say an ontology that's completely taken into the sea, beneath the hold in which her ancestors were kept under the ship, and that there's this void, and that in a lot of ways, I call this particular project a work of durational contemplation. You could also call it void work. At other times I called it presence work. What does it mean to sit in a place, to be in a place, a place of excessive meaning, to be present there, But then we could also call it void work, and I know that's a huge part of Black studies,
I was thinking of Christina Sharp's in the wake and her practice and concept of wake work when you say that. But can I jump in?
Please, do it.
Well, I was, in some ways, I don't know how people here have experienced the work, but in some sense, and coming from a different place, I was almost nodding hearing this story of, on the one hand, I have experience of disorientation, in this place, moving through it. There's many barriers to understanding, being such a polylingual, being such a multilingual installation. But at the same time, I'm pulled into it, and I feel like there's certain things that I very much recognize. And this is maybe just a side note, an anecdote, but I remember, I'd forgotten the Ceylon connection. We can go off to that, but I remember first connecting over a meal of borscht.
Okay.
At a maybe dinner party or that you were hosting. And so this was for me a moment of recognition of the bead cross. There. And it also which is also something which is like deep in my own memory of, and my own family stories, also having family coming from a place in Eastern Europe where this was also a cuisine, really common cuisine. So on the one hand, I'm pulled in to these objects which somehow seem very recognizable, but overall it's a really disorienting space. And I think the multidirectionality of memory is something which facilitates this disorientation. But and this is just thinking out loud, but a comment that is really a question, but it seems to be productive in some sense. And it seems for you that setting out with the intention of getting lost, setting out with the intention of becoming disoriented, was something that was productive. That makes me think about, when Rothberg really elaborates multidirectional memory as an aesthetics, he does it as an anachronistic aesthetics. And I think this is, and I might ask your thoughts about this, he defines this as just a basic quality of memory, bringing together the here and the now, the there and the then, into one place, and new worlds emerge out of that. And I want to think about this anachronistic aesthetics, which I keep going back to, this way of getting to Warsaw through Berlin,
right,
and the ways in which these might be, maybe we could talk about them being superimposed or one displaced into the other, this very physical, historical, political form of displacement of these people, but also just a displacement of one place onto another. I'm thinking about that anachronistic aesthetics alongside what you called poetics of citation. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about this term of poetics of citation, which is one way to describe this work, both in terms of like the materials there and also how you understand that practice.
Yeah, and also like now I'm thinking about Celan too, and that quotation from the Meridian speech that you usually cite with like, what is it, the angle of to arrive at something through a divagation? What is that? It's like the angle of something.
The term in German is the Neigungswinkel, the angle of inclination.
The angle of inclination. Yeah. So,
what's your angle of inclination?
Really, I guess the beginning of that is that the project started because I got lost in the cemetery, right? So I was visiting Inara, my partner, who was doing research in Eastern Germany and based in Berlin, and her father, who's non-Jewish German, had told her about the cemetery, and I went to it, and this is narrated in one of the wall texts. But I got lost when I went into it, and I was told that it was going to be closing soon, and so I got lost because I was afraid that it had closed on me. You know, so I got lost because I was afraid that I was locked in, not necessarily because I was lost when I thought I was lost. And I think, and so I was reading at the time a book that's in the installation called Where the Beast is Buried, by the Polish artist Joanna Rykowska, who's also from Warsaw. And her work she describes as coming out of visions that she has of public space when she kind of deprives herself of certain senses. So, like when she closes her eyes, when her senses are cut off in a certain way, and she has hearing, like she doesn't have stereophonic hearing, so she also attributes it to like her already kind of I wouldn't say distorted, but kind of reduced sense of things. She also places it within her mother's psychosis, and kind of growing up and having to experience spaces through these hallucinations and experiences of intense anxiety that her mother would have of places. But ultimately, the projects that she have come out of these like very personal visions, but then they have very public repercussions, and they ultimately become public actions, whether they're kind of public performances or public sculptures or like alternative monuments. When I made my way out of Jüdischer Friedhof Weißensee, out of this state of lostness, and the intense anxiety that built up within it, there was a sense, I think, because of Joanna's work, that what had happened to me had public repercussions. That there were repercussions of what it meant for me to be lost there, what it meant for me to experience fear there, that that meant something more than just what it felt like, you know, in this very kind of isolating personal space of revelation. And as I note in the installation, that as I was lost and as I was afraid, what I became afraid of was basically people thinking that I was a vandal. And that because I was very conscious of, like, you know, in front of synagogues in Berlin, there are armed policemen. There's this level of securitization, and I was paranoid of being basically victimized by these forces, you know, and somehow Jewish cemetery, Germany, it just brings up vandalization. Of course, this is happening in the U.S. and particularly started happening chronically after the election of the occupant of the White House. And and so in order to, like, resolve this, I started to accumulate a story, a fictional story, that my grandfather was buried there and that I was looking for him. And so in very concrete ways, like, I was trying to arrive at that space through kind of what I had, you know, which I don't have any family. I mean, my, you know, Yunara's from Berlin, but I don't have roots there necessarily. I didn't have roots in that space, you know, but I had this, I guess you could call these diasporic hauntings, you know, and then also this very kind of real haunting of the way in which securitization functions in relationship to a Jewish body. So, which then, and then we can start talking about the work that I was doing with Gaza, or what it meant for a Jewish body to be advocating solidarity with Palestinians within these spaces, which was kind of an extreme, like me reaching another level of what this Jewish body signed kind of in these spaces of securitization, whether they're real or imagined, you know. So
there's a truth in that fiction. Just think about the grandfather story. There's definitely, I think it's a fiction. It's maybe a necessary fiction, but there's some truth in there. How
we are at 40 minutes.
Okay.
So I don't know if you have some concluding thoughts, and then we can open up for questions, comments, discussion.
No, I just think as an observation, one place you left off around that these were private experiences that you're making public. I'm really interested in how that manifests on the walk, which is documented around here, and as a way of just negotiating these very two different spaces and ways of being, in addition to the other ways, the kinds of juxtapositions of places that you explore in there. So I'm personally really interested in talking more about these juxtapositions.
Yeah, these juxtapositions, and also, like, I would say that and this will lead to a question or something, but, like, I think there's, like, where I started, where I was talking about, like, the surrogate, or, like, the lawn that I was cutting outside my house being, like, part of Warsaw.
Yeah.
You know, I could also say that, you know, I could have said, like, my lawn is Gaza, you know, or I could say, like, my lawn is Yemen, you know, right now, like, that there are these, like, in some ways my implication in these places of violence that are separated from each other, are cited not even intentionally, but through the way in which trauma moves through families and then kind of appears in objects or haunts objects. So I would say that there's almost like a transubstantiation, like there's a there's like a movement of places into other places, like very directly, you know. Yeah.
That's so powerful.
Yeah. And there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I even think like on like a very, like Joanna Rykalska, the Polish artist that I was referring to, who has had such a great influence on me, in that book, she says politics is the moment that human beings decide how it is they're going to be around each other, or what it means to be together, bodies in space, you know. So I think that there's a lot of repercussions to that reality of the way in which Warsaw is in my shoes, you know, or in my shoelaces or something, or in the chair, or a spare tire that you pass on the highway or something, or there's something to be said about the kind of places that we actually live in, like what this means within ourselves, even just within this room, you know, like what is in this room. There's a lot going on in this room, you know, and I think that that our institutions and our rituals, our social rituals, do everything possible to suppress and homogenize these truths, you know, which is a great act of violence, you know. So, like, you know, and I'll end here. I just think that like my work even as a teacher on this campus, or as an artist, or a person in the grocery store or something, you know, would be to kind of intervene in some way in that reality, or the kind of reality that is trying to be shaped in opposition to the way in which we're haunted together. So, yeah. So we welcome you guys to enter this conversation, to ask questions. Raj?
Robert, what is the difference between the version of you in Berlin and Warsaw and here? Also, did you see and hear in your mind on your walk there? And also, what it is here?
That's a really, really good question. I might even repeat it for the microphone, because I don't know if it was picked up. But so the question was basically like, how are you different in Berlin than you are here, right? Essentially, it's an amazing question. I'm really glad that you asked that, because it's very significant actually. And it has everything to do with what I did in Berlin and why I did it. In Berlin, I'm a raced person, R-A-C-E-D, right? So in Berlin, I'm not a white person, the way that I'm a white person in the United States. And this was told to me by Karina Griffiths. I hope that's right. I think it's right. And she's a filmmaker, Berlin-based, really someone that I didn't get to connect with so much, but she had a really powerful influence on that first day that I arrived. And she told me this, you know, like Jews, like when she was in Toronto, where she grew up, like Jews were white ethnics. They were like, it was some, you know, okay, Jews are white people with this like religion or something. Like, and then in Europe, Jews are not. Jews are people of color, you know. The Jews are not white, whatever you want to say, right? So there's a lot underneath that, but I think a lot what I was doing specifically in the public action. So when I walked across Berlin from former deportation sites through a Palestinian commercial district to Jüdischer Friedhof Weißensee, carrying stones with Gaza written on my back, during the Great March of Return happening in Gaza and the massacres that were responding to this nonviolent kind of durational action, right? I was really doing that. In a lot of ways, it was a very ambiguous act. Some people will walk into that room and they'll see Gaza written on a shirt, or when I was walking in Berlin, they'll see Gaza written on a shirt, and they're like, I don't know what they would think. Maybe they think like immediately that I'm expressing solidarity with Palestinian suffering, But it's also just a word on a shirt. It's like the name of a place on a shirt, When I'm walking through Berlin, or most of Europe, like I'm very conscious of my phenotypical features, in a way that I'm not in the United States, in most parts of the United States. I'm very conscious of the history of race science there, which of course overlaps here. There's absolutely a history of racializing Jews in the United States that we can talk about, but for someone who's been socialized as a white man, that it comes into stark relief while I'm there, kind of in the streets, like knowing what my face and what my body signified, however many years ago, and continues to signify. So as a performance artist, I was really working with what my body is signing, and I really knew that to express, to bring up, just so we can talk about the poetics of citation, just to cite Gaza in a landscape haunted by the destruction of European Jews was to put my body into a space where it continues to be raised in very violent ways in that city and within that landscape, And that was exactly what I was trying to do, I wasn't trying to bring harm upon myself, and it was something that I thought a lot about because, Yunara, we found out that Yunara, my partner, was pregnant while we were there, and this comes up with the proximity, the poetics of proximity, like that, like the midwife that we went to where we first saw my daughter's heartbeat on a screen was in Weißensee, which is where the cemetery was, the same neighborhood.
Which is also maybe, my impression is that it's also seen as a space of increased and elevated neo-Nazi activity in Berlin as well, just to give another layer to that space, and to make your actions there even more charged.
The outlying neighborhoods, and this is like on the eastern edge of Berlin, are places where that are predominantly like refugee, like asylum houses, where refugees are living, and neo-Nazi populations, and there's a lot of violence enacted upon refugees by that, which we can also root this whole talk in, as you started us off with that poem. So,
One thing about it's interesting hearing you talk about this experience because Mayim, this poet who writes a lot around the fall of the wall, 89, and its aftermath, she talks about this experience of being raised as something which only happens, just to give further complexity to this for her, as an Afro-German woman, only after 89, in fact. She did not feel that she was being seen as an outsider prior to 89 and living in Berlin. But it's afterwards, after the unification, she writes that suddenly there's this emergent German identity, which is much more exclusive than it had been beforehand. So it's really interesting to hear you describe that, thinking about her experiences, which don't just change moving from place to place, but from one time to the next, from one year to the next, this experience changes in this act of being raised.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that too, and like the new German identity. And I met a lot of people, I became friends, and this was an important part of the project, but I became friends with a lot of Jewish Israelis that chose to live in Berlin for varying reasons. And that, and who are really critical of the way in which Germany has appropriated Jewish history and Jewish suffering into this new identity, or this post-unification identity that we okay, so for instance, when I was there was a very high-profile incident where a Palestinian teenager, obviously a refugee. There aren't Palestinians there who aren't refugees. So a Palestinian refugee teenager attacked another teenager, roughly the same age, who was wearing a kippah, who wasn't Jewish, who was also Palestinian, and was friends with an a Jewish Israeli kid, and they kind of made a bet, you can wear a kippah around Berlin, you're safe, And then he was attacked with a belt, and the kid was calling him Yehudi, and it was filmed on a phone. And then the reaction to that was where people did these demonstrations. Well, someone in the German government said, advised Jews not to wear kippahs in public anymore, and so the reaction was that everyone should wear a kippah, And it's something that Rothberg is really critical of in his new book, The Implicated Subject. When everyone was like, "We are Trayvon Martin," And even after the shooting in Halle, where a white supremacist, misogynist, gunman, terrorist, tried to enter a synagogue in a city in eastern Germany to murder people in there, to massacre people in there, couldn't get in, and then went into a Turkish shop and shot someone else on the street. And there was someone from that community who gave an interview who said, please don't say that you're Jewish in this, or that you're a victim of this violence. That this terrorist was trying to attack very specific populations who are right now under threat by these politics, and that he was trying to attack Jews, he was trying to attack Muslims, he was trying to attack immigrants, he was trying to attack women, and that we have to be very clear about who is vulnerable in these contexts, and not to erase that through this kind of naive liberalism, So I don't know. That was a long divagation. Yeah, sorry.
It got us deeper into the work. So
yeah.
I'd like to see if there's any other comments or questions. I know if you had that.
I actually haven't seen the art yet. I was just reading the artist's statement, and a couple of things that struck me were the sense of spending 6 months with a place or something. It just doesn't seem like our society does that very much, and so that kind of stuck out to me. And then also, I had a sense or an idea that there was a listening quality, or a relationship quality. And I think also that's not something that really is very alive in our society. I don't know if I have a question around that, but those are two things that struck me.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was I arrived and the institute wanted to know what I was going to do. And I was just I'm going to go there every day. And I'm going to basically contemplate and be in contact with it. And then see what happens. And I'm going to build something out from that place of lostness, Yeah. Yeah.
I was really interested, and you answered some of this, but I'm interested in how you see the connection between the performance aspect of the art and the archive. And you answered that with talking about objects as surrogates for the experience of the place.
Yeah.
Because you've got a lot of different objects, a lot of different experiences going on in the exhibit.
Yeah. So the archive in the center, on the racks in the center of the room, those are. It's kind of like the second layer comes after my body. Like first there's my body there. And like I'm also there as a poet. Like I go to places as a poet, you know, so there's like this emphasis that I give on turning experience, translating experience into not just words, but like, you know, I come from a tradition as a poet that I root in Paul Celan. So like the word, I mean, what does he say? Like reality has to be fought for in one of his speeches, you know? Like the word is this kind of, and also this, in some ways this is a very Jewish concept as well, you know, that I specifically relate to Pesach or Passover, the Seder, where there's a certain way in which one arrives at the telling of something, you know? So like for me, being this work of durational contemplation started actually as a practice, as a practice of as a poet. Like where when I was 20 or 19, I started going to the ruins of my great-grandparents' apartment above the store that my grandfather was still running and in which he was born. And I wanted to be in contact with that space, again, to kind of find something of myself or where I come from, you know, and to interrogate it, you know. And I spent every day going into work with him and just sitting in this cold, like roof caving in, dead birds on the floor, like 40-year-old salt in the cupboard, broken tables, like mannequins and old suits, and just like sitting in there with the typewriter. So like the typewriter is a specific trope for me as well. And trying to arrive at words, you know, and I wrote a poem called The Blacksmith, which is a dialogue between my grandfather's Jewish soul and his assimilated soul, or Tovia and Theo. And it's like, it was the beginning of what would become like a very minimalist poetic. So there's 2 words, 3 words, 1 word on a page, and they're speaking back and forth in this way, you know. And so that's kind of where I get to, like, if I go to a site like Baba Yar in Kiev, like where the Jewish population of Kiev was massacred, which I was at, and actually there's soil from that site in the large sculptural work, the Lutz work, that's integrated in there, along with all of these other materials. Like if I had 2 words come out of being there, like that's kind of what I want, like as a poet. Like I want 2 words, you know. And so, like really the center of that installation are these pages, you know. It very much it is the work of a poet, you know. But in some way, I'm trying to build this larger thing. Like I'm trying to say, like, yeah, it's not just the words that end up on the page, but it's like the whole story, and it's the place, and it's like the boots I was wearing and the hat I was wearing, and it's like this pipe that I found on the sidewalk while I was walking to the Friedhof that I didn't know why I picked up, but I knew that I had to, and then I took it back and I meditated on it, and then eventually it came to kind of stand in for the technological innovation of the genocidal weapon of gassing, which started with vans, you know, with automobiles. And so the way in which kind of like the genocide was embedded in, like again, the mundane, you know, like the automobile, the rusted off exhaust pipe, you know, and then of course the exhaust pipe also, there's like a note on the text next to the exhaust pipe that says like, pipe equals contradiction, perpetuate, breathing equals perpetuation. And it's kind of like, it goes you know what I mean? Like when you talked about like the disorienting, but also the mundane, like that's going, like that's happening. Yeah, in there, yeah. So, and the poem and the word is like a really important part of that. So like quite literally, I was writing inside of a cemetery. And in some ways, I was thinking about like how like I've been really moved by the original manuscripts of poets, and particularly poets who are writing in times of turmoil, you know, and the way in which the environment within which they acted and chose to write and to mark a page, the way in which the words, but also the marks on the page and the stains on the page and the wrinkles, like evoke that page and those words, or that page as a total object that holds the environment in which they were responding. You know, so like those pages that are blown up on the wall for people to look as landscapes, and then also to feel with their hands and to look at, are records of the time and space in which I was dwelling, which have these political, historical repercussions, you know. Yeah. Is there? It's probably time to disperse.
Yeah, we should wrap up in 2 minutes. If anyone else has any questions, the only other thing I thought of, Robert, that would be interesting to hear is bringing up. You've put this space. This is now in a space that's open to spectators. You've exposed it to viewers. It's, as you've described it to me, a life work, right? And it's still going. It's still happening. Could you share just a little bit? And I don't know how concise we can be, but how the experience was for creating an installation, creating a space for people to try to experience what you experienced.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't know, actually. My intentions in building it, I spent about a year working on it, and mostly in the abstract, you know, like mapping it out. I think was to create a space in which to create a place of study, which is something that other artists have done for me. And something that people could return to, something that people could get lost in, and to also to get lost in and to find their own way out of, distinct from the exit and the entrance of the gallery. So, you know, I have some pretty severe things to say about what it means to be Jewish right now. And that are very important to me, for me to say, and it's important for me to say in front of my ancestors and in front of the communities to which I devote myself to, including this campus community. And I think that I tried to create a space in which the confrontation with that severity could be holy, you know. So, yeah.
And accessible.
And
if I could
yeah.
say.
Anybody else before we? Robert, do you have any other closing thoughts, or Jason, before we?
Did you want to ask something? Or? No? Raj, yeah?
I was wondering, how does discrimination perpetuates itself under the guise of those who identify with the victim and
Yeah, it's a big question. I think that that I've exhausted myself, and I would do disrespect to the question to try to answer it right now. But I will engage with you over that question in the coming days, and I appreciate you asking it. So, yeah, it's important.
Yeah. We'll end on that one. Thank you both.
Okay. Thank you.
For diving in so deep and honestly, and exposing, so many different levels of experiencing the work and how personal that experience has been for you in so many different ways. And I think this really showed through the conversation. Jason, thank you again for making the trip from University of Washington to come up and share in this space. So thank you both.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.